Welcome to Poets House live streaming. My name is Paolo Javier, broadcasting tonight from Lenape Haking, specifically the unceded territory of the Rockaway, Canarsie, and Matinacock peoples, otherwise known as Queens County, New York City. Poets House tonight joins with all people of conscience to express outrage and pain as crisis continues to grip our nation. Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Ahmaud Arbery murdered are just among the most recent victims of systemic racism in our nation. I want to say personally, unequivocally, that Black trans lives matter. Simultaneously, this week we acknowledge the dreadful new threshold of deaths from COVID-19, which, because of systemic inequity, inordinately impacts communities of color. Poets House acts on the belief that poetry bears witness, incites a language of mutuality and care, and by so doing insists on individual and collective action to bring about change. To this point, tonight's broadcast recognizes the Poetry Path and Poets House's 10th anniversary in Lower Manhattan, as well as the power in giving voice to the poet's own individual history and poetic legacy. For the Poetry Path, we have carefully chosen about 40 fragments of poems and a few whole poems to place at various sites along the Riverwalk. We have picked poetry that sweeps across the diversity of times, cultures, and aesthetics. Our hope is that this project will increase awareness of the built and natural environment and the relationship between the two in and around Ten River Terrace, inviting passersby into a more profound experience of poetic language. Noting this, I'm so pleased to be welcoming tonight's presenter, Lawrence Joseph, who has a fragment from his poetry included in the path. In his craft talk, A Life of Making Poems, Lawrence Joseph will draw on his most recent book, A Certain Clarity, Selected Poems, which spans nearly 40 years, to speak about the impact his Lebanese and Syrian Catholic heritage, his professional life as a lawyer and legal scholar, and the economies of the world of working class labor from which he comes have had on his work and what it means to write poetry during the politically turbulent times in which we live. After his talk, Mr. Joseph will offer a creative writing prompt for our viewers that cover his themes and subjects. Lawrence Joseph, the grandson of Lebanese and Syrian immigrants, was born in Detroit. He is the author of numerous books of poetry and 2 books of prose, Lawyerland, a nonfiction novel, and The Game Changed, essays and other prose. His awards include 2 National Endowment for the Arts fellowships and a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation. He is Tinley Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law and lives in New York City, actually right down the street from Poets House. I am so pleased and grateful that Lawrence Joseph is our guest tonight and greatly look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Paolo. And thank you for that wonderful, not only introduction to my work, but the prior to that, your statements on behalf of Poets House about the present condition politically, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, all of which you stated with force and with articulation that I greatly appreciate and endorse, of course, with all my heart. And I want to also say it's a real pleasure to be here with you and here at Poets House. My talk is going to be about the paths of my poetry. The poem of mine that is in the Poetry Path, I'm going to read it and then talk about that. But first, I want to make some introductory remarks. I'm very grateful to be a part of the Poetry Path. Now, Poets House has been an important part of my path as a poet since 1986, when it was my great fortune to be on the original Poets House Poets Advisory Committee. Since its inception, Poets House has contributed immeasurably to the lives and paths of countless poets the world over. It is vital to the art of poetry. It is a national and international treasure. I want to talk today about my path, first about my path as a poet, and then I'll present a writing prompt based on lines from a poem by the brilliant Chen Chen. Every poet has their own paths, their own lives as poets. My life began in the city of Detroit, where I was born in 1948, shortly after World War II. My grandparents were Lebanese and Syrian Catholic immigrants. They came to the United States, one grandfather over the Mexican border illegally, in the early years of the 20th century. They were among Detroit's first Arab Americans. Both my grandfathers ran grocery stores. My parents were born in Detroit at the end of World War I. They attended Catholic parochial grade and high schools and lived their entire lives in Detroit. After World War II, my father inherited his father's store. I grew up in Detroit. I went to a Catholic grade school and to Detroit's Jesuit high school. During my freshman year at the University of Michigan, I wrote my first poems, and I've been writing poetry ever since. After graduate school in English at the University of Cambridge, I studied law at Michigan, beginning my 45-year career as a lawyer, as a judicial law clerk, a litigator, and mostly as a legal scholar and law professor. The last 33 years as a professor of law at St. John's University School of Law in Queens, the borough of Queens, in, as Paolo said, Queens County. My wife, Nancy Van Gotham, and I moved from Detroit to New York City in 1981. We've lived for almost 40 years in downtown Manhattan, the last 26 years in Battery Park City, just blocks away from where Poets House stands today. My life as a poet has been a continuous interweaving of these different pathways, different places, different identities, different experiences. In a poem, The Game Changed, in my book, Into It, I write, I too am thinking of it as a journey. The journey of conversations, otherwise known as the Divina Commedia, is how Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian poet, characterized Dante's poem. For me, poetry has always been a journey of witness, a journey of pathways of language. At this moment, my path as a poet is, as every poet's path is, determined by the pandemic. In mid-March, a certain clarity, a selection of my poems that spans 40 years of my work was published, just as New York City went into lockdown. The poems in A Certain Clarity embody social, political, and personal subjects that have been a part of my work from the beginning. The poem of mine that isn't a part of the poetry path is entitled Once Again. It's the last poem in my 2005 book, Into It, and is included in A Certain Clarity. Let me read it to you. Once again, the esplanade, high summer, the sea is beyond the sunset's light, the shapes a mast, the sky a current carrying us along, heavy with that green and that black. Fate's precisive wheel revolving, forces writhing wheel, the stealing, the killing, accomplished by new types of half monsters. It's what I said. The poem is the dream, a dream technique, the primary soul substance on which our attention is fixed. Supernal, metaphysical, in other words, a representation, as we have seen, of mythical origins. Something felt, something needed as much as we needed. A woman, a man, loves characters, the myth their own. We are agreed. The moon is low, its silent flame across the garden of roses, almost level with the harbor. We place our hands on the silence and once again repeat the vow. What are once again's pathways? First of all, it's a poem of place. A scene is set. The Esplanade is the Esplanade in Battery Park City along the Hudson River. It's high summer, as it is as we speak now. There is the sea. Here, the sea, the point at which the Hudson turns into New York Harbor. There's the sunset's light. Once again was written after the suicide bombings of the World Trade Center's towers on September 11, 2001. Nancy and I lived then, as we do now, a block or so away from ground zero. We were evacuated from our apartment. We lived in Queens with a colleague of mine from St. John's for 6 weeks. Once again was also written after the criminal, murderous invasion by the United States of Iraq. It was a time politically, as our time is now, of stealing and killing accomplished by new types of half monsters. But the poet is always making the poem a dream technique, an expression of our primary soul substance. And at the heart of this poet's clarity, there are love's characters. And seen along this esplanade, not far from Poet's House, and as Paolo said, the poems in the poetry path. And once again, there's a moon. It's silent flame across the garden of roses, almost level with the harbor. And there are the deepest testaments and the truest pathways of the poet, who once again repeats the vow of love.
Thank you, Larry. That talk was so concise and actually leaves me wanting to hear more specifics about your trajectory as a poet. But thank you for generously sharing all of the personal information, certainly your experience with your wife during 9/11, and your views on language and the purpose of poetry in your own practice. A couple of things I thought maybe we could, touch on, and then hopefully segue into your creative writing prompt, which I'm looking forward to. Is a couple of things. Let's start with your unique path as a poet in terms of how you've made your living as a poet, made your living as an individual who writes poetry, which certainly in the last 25, you can argue 30 years, is a different path taken by, let's say, most poets who have chosen teaching of poetry as a way to put food on the table, to support themselves and to support your poetry. But you actually have been a practicing lawyer and a law professor for several decades. And I think immediately for me as a poet, and you, I'm sure can relate to this, where we access the side of the brain to create our poetry is on one side, and yet you have the law profession, which is so specific with language, right? Which is on the other side. And I wanted to hear from you how you have made, how this experience has been for you as a poet, working as a full-time lawyer, but also teaching law, and how this has forked into your path as a poet, and maybe they both ended up actually feeding each other, both energies. So
I could have been my entire talk, or at least a good part of it.
yeah.
I really appreciate your focusing on the question. I thought about going off on the different dimensions of my life in the talk, but I thought that would also detract from what I wanted to get to, was the poem itself that's in the poetry path. So I really appreciate this chance to answer your questions or your inquiries in this conversation that we're having. Um, the decision to become a lawyer, my parents, my grandparents were, uh, two of them were illiterate. One could, they all spoke English, and they spoke English well, but they didn't. One one wrote, could write English, and two could read English. Um, and they were very important in my life because we lived with them when I was a child, and uh, and they were store owners, and they led the life of immigrants. One of my grandfathers literally came over illegally over the Mexican border in the first decade of the 20th century. Um, my parents were Catholic. We were born Catholic, Eastern Catholics, uh, a part of the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church. Well, my parents were educated in parochial Catholic schools and high schools, and that was the extent of their education. They were very well educated in those parochial schools. Um, my generation, which includes a very large extended family, we've all gone to college. Um, and In my parents' generation, the only person who had gone to college was an uncle who I'm very close to, my mother's brother, who became a lawyer, and was a very important person in my life and my brother's life. And my older brother, is a lawyer. And then once I began writing poetry as an undergraduate, uh, the uh, uh, I knew I was going to write poetry the rest of my life. And the decision to go to law school was in part the uh, uh, a decision made by the class grounds. I mean, I come from a my father ended up working for A&P as a meat cutter and was unionized. I come from a lower middle class, um, quote unquote, working class background, and I knew I was going to write poetry, and I wanted to write poetry with the utmost integrity at the highest level I could write it at. And I knew I would do it for the rest of my life. I basically chose to become a lawyer to protect that, um, uh, to have the way I made a living completely separate from the writing of my poetry, to give me the freedom to write the poetry the way I needed to write it, at the level I wanted to write it, at the pace that I needed to write it at. And so I decided to go to law school, which I was pretty much raised to be a lawyer. Um, and I realized then consciously at the time. I had just returned from graduate school in Cambridge and certainly could have gone on studying English literature or going into a writing program, that creative writing program, that if I built two professions, poetry being a profession and also a vocation, the need to do it, I would just have to work harder than everybody, or work hard. I don't know, work harder than anybody else, but I'd have to work hard. And so I just decided that that's what I would do. Come from a family of workers and hard workers, and so that's why I made that decision. What has it given me? It's given me that freedom. Um, it's also given me over a career an enormous amount of experience with the real world, a world of social world, laws of social language. It's our most intricate social language. And I know it. I understand the legal language. I understand what law deals with. It deals with every political and social economic issue in the United States. And so my inclination, which has always been to think socially and politically, has been greatly expanded by a career, a long career in law. And I think the language and that type of experience has added greatly to what I've done. And so that's in particular to law. As for having a career separate from writing, uh, uh, I think that, again, it's at least that was my sense. Um, I certainly don't universalize this, but it's my sense that it would give me a kind of vantage point, a kind of outsider's point on the writing of poetry in my time.
Uh, Forgive me if I missed this in both our conversations prior to this talk and in your talk, but I wanted to ask you, um, how actively did you practice law? Uh, was teaching law the more prominent experience for you, or were you doing both? And I say this because it ties back to your poetry, the incredible volumes of poetry that you've been able not just to write but to publish, right, in the midst of these responsibilities, is just frankly quite staggering for me and awe-inspiring. So I just really curious to know if did you practice, how many years of practicing as a lawyer were folded into, or perhaps
I
simultaneous teaching?
out of law school in Michigan, I had met Nancy uh, while I was in law school, and then we moved in. We got married and we lived in Detroit. And my first work was as a law clerk, a judicial law clerk with a justice on the Michigan Supreme Court, which was a 2-year clerkship. And the judge I clerked for had been the Democratic governor of Michigan from 1948 to 1960, and was in his time a leading progressive, and went and identified himself as a progressive, especially in matters of race, and was uh, among the governors in the United States during the 1950s, had done more for civil rights and race recognition than any other governor in the country. In the Senate, and it was Hubert Humphrey. Um, and then he went into the Kennedy administration, and then stayed until the mid '60s, and then returned to Michigan, and then he became a member of the Michigan Supreme Court. That was an enormously valuable experience for me, because of his knowledge not only of Detroit but of politics and the kinds of issues that were going on politically in the United States, and especially Detroit, in the 1970s. Um, and we moved to New York, and then I taught. I taught in Detroit at the University of Detroit Law School for 3 years. And then right from my clerkship. And then when we moved to New York, I practiced for 3 years as a litigator at a firm. And then I went back into teaching, which I wanted to do. And so I've mostly taught and have taught since the 1980s. And I've been at St. John's for the last 33 years or so. And so legal academia is very different than other academia because the law professors are very linked to the practice of law. I wrote a book called Lawyerland, which dealt with the practice of law. And it's essentially a novel, but kind of documentary novel. And deals a lot with my sort of living in the life of the law, or being in the life and the language of law. And I've taught thousands of students. I've taught mostly labor and employment law, and I've taught compensation law, which includes workers' compensation, accident law, injury law, like the 9/11 compensation funds, et cetera, like that, which are sort of advanced compensation law problems. And I've taught jurisprudence, and I've taught a course in legal interpretation, and I've published. I've published legal scholarship, and so that's been the career over a period of time. And I wanted to establish a real legal career. The person that I followed very closely on this was Wallace Stevens, who had an effect on my poetry, but also the fact that he was a lawyer and basically practiced his entire professional life as a lawyer, ultimately as an in-house counsel at the Hartford Insurance. But the law professor, I did not practice. I had no clients or whatever from the time I started teaching. I pretty much am focused on legal scholarship, legal thought, and teaching. And I've taught, I guess, as I mentioned, many students over a period of time. I've also taught in Queens most of my legal career. And as we've talked about Queens. Queens is a very important place in my life because of not only many of my students, or most of my students, come from Queens or the extension of Queens, Long Island, until it no longer becomes Queens, and Brooklyn, but Queens County, and that's had a very strong effect on me. The fact that I've been at St. John's.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, it does, and it invites so many other questions that I'm afraid we won't have time for. So let me focus on the question I had in mind prior to you giving that voluminous answer. And I just want to stay on our path for now about that. You talked about, for you, that writing poetry is a journey of witness. And we are heading into 2021, which is going to be the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which certainly compelled a lot of poets to bear witness to this, unbelievable tragedy. And certainly for you, it's a personal one. And now here we are staring down, coming to grips with another tragedy that none of us could say with any certainty we saw coming. Although we've read about it, that this is a possibility, but to say that it would come and settle in our nation the way that it has, and spread in our nation the way that it has through human error and human stubbornness, right? I don't think anyone could really be prepared for that. So could you talk to me about what exactly the poetry of witness means for you, and if you have examples that you'd both drew from when you were coming up as a poet and continue to draw from today. Maybe speak to that.
Well, what I've actually, I mean, it's from the beginning of my poetry. My first book of poems opens where I'm with my father in Detroit on the first night of the insurrection in Detroit in the store. And the Detroit insurrection in 1967, July of 1967. The night was July 23rd, 1967. Was recently been come to the attention of, and I'm happy it has, of in light of what's been going on in this country with Black Lives Matter, and that constant, and I'm very grateful for it, raising of consciousness of the racism and horrors of racism, in systemic racism, structural racism that's existed in the United States from its inception. It was in the Constitution of the United States. And so I witnessed that. Detroit in the 1970s was the hardest hit of all American cities during that decade. And I witnessed, again, I became acutely aware of this systemic violence, the violence of capital against labor. And it expressed itself in what I taught, what people I knew, family, friends, children, etc. In New York, in the early 80s, was in a recession, and then we went into these finance capital, this kind of beginnings of these kind of turn in finance capital, which I've witnessed. 9/11, I witnessed directly, and then the war in Iraq. That was, to me, and I write about it. I'm writing about all of this, writing about war. I was writing about war from the beginning, and I've continued to write about war virtually in every one of my books. And I've been doing that for almost 40 years of publishing poetry. Now we have a situation where the pandemic, the virus is not political. The virus comes out of nature. The virus kills. And in that sense, if speaking as a human being, it's evil. Its purpose, what it does, is if it enters your body, it tries to kill you. And this is now throughout the entire world. The effect this has on social and political worlds is one that we're witnessing right now, on top of the effects that we were having from I don't even like to name the evil that was in the government of the United States, and has been in the end present in awful ways, an understatement, horrendous ways, for too long now. And all of that's now exacerbated, and we're living in that now, as are all social and political realities that were not good. I mean, I ended my last book, which was the ending of the poems in a certain clarity. The last poems I wrote in that were before the 2016 election, and issues of capital and labor and war certainly had not been resolved then, and now they're an environment, climate change, finance, capital, the injustices, imprisonment, the racism. Now that all of that has been exponentially pressured, and that's what we're living in. My question is would we do that for poets? And I am heartened of your generation, and especially of coming to these realizations prior to this pandemic, and aware of the effect that this pandemic is having on what existed prior to it in the United States, and conscious of it and writing about it. And now you'll be able to write about it too. We'll be able to write about it. We'll take it in as poets have always taken in what they need to take in. And we'll take it in as American poets because we write in the American language. At least I will take it in as an American poet who writes in the American language with the part and the traditions of the poets in the American language and in world literature also, who have dealt with problems of destruction of by the state, uh, uh, of racism, the destruction of labor, war, imperialism. Those are the poets that I draw on and still draw on and will draw on. And I draw on those of us who are presently taking this on. And I'm very grateful to that. I'm grateful to have that in this time of we have the dominance of of evil that we are now trying to resist and go past in every way.
Great. I just can appreciate the perspective you have in terms of language as both a formerly practicing lawyer, but a law professor and certainly a poet, and your vantage point of how this pandemic has been unfolding on a human level, certainly, but then also on a legislative level, on a governmental level in terms of how it's been politicized and in the language in which that is essayed to the viewers, to the readers, and you see it responded to, against, supported by, legalese, right, from all sides. And so it's just something that I don't take for granted as a poet who is not a lawyer, right, who does not teach law. I can certainly appreciate where you would be coming from and the tremendous burden that this awareness that you have that the rest of us may not be as immediately sensitive to or even know how to wrap our heads around it, that you have how many decades of experience wrapping your head around. Maybe we can shift to the more generative action. I would love to segue to your prompt. What do you have in store for us, Larry? And then I'll turn it over to you.
And I've never done a writing prompt because I have never taught creative writing. And so I haven't done a writing prompt before. But I went on and looked at what you've been done at Poets House before. And what I've done is I've chosen lines from Chen Chen's poem, a magnificent poem, Set the Gardens on Fire, which is part of the poetry path. And
Great.
And so what I want to do is read that and then talk about it and then do prompts. In other words, whoever is watching it do a prompt to write a poem based on my perceptions of what Chen Chen does in these lines and how one might write a poem for that. As I mentioned, for my writing prompt, I've chosen lines from Chen Chen's magnificent Set the Gardens on Fire, which are part of the poetry path and, as Paolo indicated, are, fortunately for all of us, installed right now. And let me read them to you. From Set the Garden on Fire by Chen Chen. Let's build the community garden that never was. Let's call the neighbors out. Call for an orchard, not a wall. Trees with arms free, flaming into apple, peach, pear, every imaginable edible fire. Let me read it again. Let's build the community garden that never was. Let's call the neighbors out. Call for an orchard, not a wall. Trees with arms free, flaming into apple, peach, pear, every imaginable edible fire. First of all, the opening lines, to build the community garden that never was, are really quite extraordinary. and kind of bring you directly into this vision that is compressed in these 6 lines that have been chosen. Really remarkable. Note the poet locates a place, and he asks that we, its readers, its listeners, build a community garden that never was. So, as a prompt, first imagine a place that never was. In other words, an imagined place. And once you have your imagined place in mind, once you've gone through that process of coming up with a place that never was, then imagine what you want to put into the imagined place. In other words, set your imaginative scene, visualize it, envision it the way that Chen Chen envisions his space that never was. And once you've got your imagined scene and you're visualizing your imagining scene, generally, then you begin to focus on it and you fill it in. You can fill it in with neighbors or trees or flowers or apples, maybe. You can fill it in with whatever images you imagine this imagined space to be. Again, you envision it. So you've got this interior space, your imagined space, which is prompted by these magnificent lines by Chen Chen. And then you fill it, you envision it, you see it, you feel it, you look at it, you touch it, you use the senses to flesh it out. And then once you've got that in your imagination, you begin to imagine what you see as a poem. So you build, to use Chen Chen's word, or construct or form your poem. And there you go into the way in which you choose a form that will fit and form and shape the imagined space that you've envisioned. So finally, in this poem that you want to build, make sure that you make your language on fire with the fire of poetry. And once you're there, you've got a poem. It takes some work to see clearly what you want to see that never was. Maybe take some notes and write them down, work them over, expand them, and then you'll already be thinking about how you want to shape them in terms of the form you want to use. I want to thank Paolo and everybody at Poets House for all that they do. And I don't know of any place that does more for poetry in the entire world than Poets House does. And special thanks to Paolo.
Thank you so much, Lawrence Joseph, everybody. His latest book is called A Certain Clarity, a generous selection of his poems from his volumes of poems published over several decades of mastering this craft. It's published by the great publisher FSG, Farrar Straus Giroux. And to everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. As ever, be kind, be compassionate, let's support each other. And till we see each other again, take care.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.